This video is for A-level economics and it's looking at macroeconomics with regards to protectionism. Now just a reminder, protectionism is an expenditure switching policy to try to reduce a trade account deficit. So this video is going to focus on a quota. So what is a quota? It is a restriction on the volume of imports into a country over a specific time period. Now by limiting those imports, the quota is designed to protect domestic industries from that foreign competition and support local business activity. Now, so when we're considering the reasons for a quota, we have to think about the specific industries it might be protected and why. So, for example, one industry might be considered to be an infant industry. So what I mean by that is it needs that support from the government to help it to grow and help it to develop. So that quota might be for a time period to help that industry to grow and to develop and therefore be more internationally competitive, and the quota will not, well, I suppose it won't be needed anymore. Or it might be a sunset industry where, for example, it's starting to decline because of the struggles to compete internationally and with foreign companies obviously exporting their products into this market. And therefore, the reason for the quota might actually be to protect jobs. So what I mean by that is to reduce possible structural unemployment. Now, the risks of a quota is, well, clearly there could be retaliation. Countries are not going to like it if their exports are suffering from that of a quota. So they might retaliate by also placing quotas on that country's exports. It also will result in overall higher prices for the consumer in that market. And I'll go into that more when I look at the diagram, but because there'll be higher prices, then that will mean that there'll be reduced consumer surplus. And it won't only be higher prices, but it'll be obviously reduced choice because of the restricted volume of imports. Now, because of that quota, it is disrupting and it's distorting global trade. And what that means is that countries are losing out on the gains of comparative advantage. And therefore, they could be importing the benefits of specialisation and increased productivity, but they're not able to do so because of this quota. So let's think of some examples of a quota. So this is the MFA, all right, and this is just a historical example from the US. And the purpose of the MFA was to establish a regulation on global textile and apparel trades. So it allowed developed countries such as the US to impose quotas on imports from developing countries, and the goal is to protect domestic industries from a surge of low-cost imports. Now, in terms of the types of countries that it focused on, it was the likes of China, India, Bangladesh. And in terms of the scope, the quotas under the MFA apply to a wide range of products, including clothing, yarn, and fabrics. So it did protect the US industry, it did help maintain jobs and production domestically, but it did also result in higher prices for US customers. So let's consider the diagram. So the diagram starts off as a usual international trade diagram where we're looking at a particular market, and in this particular market, world supply is seen to be perfectly elastic because of the sheer number of countries and producers from those countries in the world. So, for example, if there's a price change, we expect there's to be at least one producer across the world who can respond perfectly to that change in price. The volume of imports is going to be from Q1 to Q2. So my quota is going to be between that amounts, okay? So I've picked Q3. So the volume of imports that I'm allowing into this country is restricted to Q2, Q3. Now that creates a new supply curve, and that new supply curve shows the domestic supply as well as that quota of imports which were allowed into the country. Now, because of that though, it creates a price change. So we are no longer operating at world price 1, we are now operating at a world price 2. And the reason for that is due to the lost efficiencies that these exporters are experiencing. And a prime example of that is because of the restricted volume, because remember quotas directly limit the quantity of goods that can be traded, it prevents suppliers from operating at full capacity for this country. So this disrupts their ability to lower average costs by spreading fixed costs over that larger export output volume. So a container shipment, just as an example, they rely on large consistent volumes to maximise that efficiency. So if quotas limit exports to only half of, for example, a container's capacity, the cost per unit shipped increases significantly. So suppliers may need to send smaller shipments to comply with those quotas rather than fully utilising their bulk transport systems like those container ships. And this raises the per unit shipping costs, which then gets passed on to the consumers. There's also high administrative costs, so quotas introduce additional administrative overheads, and that just simply adds further to the cost. So now, because of this restriction, well suppliers are only willing to offer it at well price. Now, this will instantly obviously reduce the consumer surplus. So this was the previous consumer surplus, but because of the increase in price, there is a contraction, as we can see here on the arrow, a contraction in demand, which reduces the consumer surplus to this. Now, the producer surplus was previously at that green area, but now because of the higher price, which is being caused because of the quota, the producer surplus does increase. But as we can see from when the world price was at world price 1, a net welfare loss is created. So what we've got is we've got a massive reduction in consumer surplus. Some of it is gained by the producer, the domestic producer, and some of it is gained by the international producer, as shaded in purple. But because that's an international producer, we can't really consider it as a gain for this country. So what we have to highlight is because of the loss of consumer surplus, the shaded areas in purple and blue are going to be the net welfare loss, which if you've had a look at the tariff diagram, that net welfare loss is greater than that of a tariff.